Today, we're looking at the Teamsters Union workers striking at Molson Coors in Texas. And next week, 5,000 workers at Anheuser-Busch expected to walk out. Now, this builds on the strike momentum, which surged last year. Over 460 strikes in 2023. That's up from the year before, according to a report from Cornell and the University of Illinois. For more on what we might see from unions this year, we have Seth Harris, former top labor policy advisor to President Biden, senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change, and distinguished professor of practice at Northeastern University. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. And so as we look at the strike momentum, already seeing it as we've seen with workers at Molson Coors here, but why do you think we're going to continue to see this in 2024?
Well, I think workers are still very angry at corporate profits far outstripping the increase in their wages. They were hit by inflation over the last year or two, or really 2 years, and their real wages have only begun to go up over the course of the last year. At the same time, corporations have been making epic profits, and that is a consequence of their hard work. They're also still very angry about what happened during the pandemic, where they felt they didn't get the respect or the protection or the help that they needed from their employers. And so they're banding together and demanding contracts, as they did in 2023, when we saw some of the most important improvements in collective bargaining, some of the best contracts that workers have seen at companies like UPS, the big three automakers out in Hollywood. So I think we're going to continue to see that in 2024. Maybe not at the same level, probably at a somewhat lower level, but I think we're still going to see activated workers going out on strike.
Seth, the thinking over the last few years has been that this union movement has gained momentum partly because the labor market is so tight. The thinking is that these companies need these employees. Do they still hold that leverage today at a time when we've seen so many companies in cost-cutting mode?
Well, they do, because we still have very tight labor markets, although that's not the entirety of the story. Unemployment's still below 4%. It's been below 4% for the longest period since the late 1960s. Workers quit bad jobs, got good jobs, and are now really settling in. But a lot of what we saw in 2023 was not merely a consequence of a tight labor market. It was workers in industries where there were barriers to entry for workers who might replace them. You know, you can't just walk in off the street and build a car. You can't just walk in off the street and write a television script. And so those workers had an immense amount of power in their dealings with their companies. Other unions, like the Teamsters at UPS, had such a gigantic number of workers involved that replacing them was just inconceivable. You were not going to find 330,000 truck drivers to replace the Teamsters at UPS. So those unions had an immense amount of power going into their negotiations with their unions. The same thing could be said in the healthcare sector. Now, in other sectors like the fast food sector, companies like Starbucks in warehousing with companies like Amazon, there's not quite as much worker power because those workers are much more readily replaced. And so there is a danger for those workers if they go out on strike. Now, they can do short, targeted strikes, strategic strikes, and they did that, and it was very effective, but it's not quite the same as the UAW taking 50,000 workers out to the picket lines.
And Seth, as you mentioned, there's a lot of nuance here. For some of them, it's about sort of making up for some of the concessions they made during the great financial crisis when it came to the auto workers. But when you look at, say, the actors' strike, some of that was also about future-proofing their industries as well. How much does that factor into some of the costs and some of the pushback that we're likely to see from companies, especially when you think of just being at the beginning of what large language model AI can do?
Yes, that's an extremely important point. A good bit of what happened with both the actors and the writers in Hollywood related to the use of artificial intelligence in script writing, in the images of actors being duplicated and triplicated and being used in crowd scenes and other ways. And so the unions negotiated protections for their members. That is going to be an issue in some industries. I don't think we know the breadth of the effect of AI on employment just yet. but it's certainly going to matter in industries like journalism and other information sector industries, and also industries that rely very heavily on data. For example, in the technology industry with coding, I think it's going to be a very, very important application. So the question really that will come up at the bargaining table is, will technology be used by employers to cut costs, to lay off workers, or will it be used in a complementary way with the workers that they have to make those workers more productive, to create more job opportunities, to help those workers to increase their wages? That's exactly the kind of issue that collective bargaining is well positioned to help address. The problem is 89% of American workers don't have a union. And so those issues will be addressed by non-union companies in a way that maximizes their profits rather than maximizing their workers.
Seth, we'll have to have you back on to talk about what's happening in our own industry and journalism with the organization happening in newsrooms there as well. Really do appreciate your insight today. Seth Harris, former top labor policy advisor to President Biden.